as to be expected, the World Bank are estimating that this pandemic is really going to take its toll on Asian economies. They've been specific. From 5.8% growth in 2019, they expect China to grow to 2.1%. It is a worst case scenario, but what do you think the likelihood is of that?
Look, I think it becomes likelier if we see economic activity around the world being disrupted for an extended period of time. Just this week, we saw that record low PMI out of Italy, right? And I think it's those kinds of concerns that may feed into the second round effects for Asia. In other words, even if Asia were to see a sharp recovery on its own merits, then the question is, who would Asia manufacture for, or who would they export to, right? And this is where domestic demand will be key. And to be fair, there have been a lot of supportive measures around the region on that front, because by shoring up domestic demand, that could reduce the likelihood of Asian economies realizing their worst case scenario.
You can't look at the global economy without looking at Asia, China specifically, the world's second largest economy. But do you see that after this pandemic, we hope after comes soon, but do you think the rest of the world will change the way it does business with China? Just over the weekend, there was a report in the Sunday Times talking about Huawei's relationship with Britain. We know that was already controversial, and there was a leaked comment from Downing Street saying there would be a reckoning, that now geopolitically a lot of Chinese firms will have a lot of answers to supply to a lot of people who are frankly really annoyed with them.
Yeah, and you raise a few very good points there. So if I may, I'd like to address this using a couple of lenses. Firstly, if we look at this purely from economic terms, right? Look, China is unrivaled in terms of its sheer scale and also its manufacturing powers, right? So there's a reason why China has found itself so integrated into the global system over the years, right? Now, I don't think this outbreak in and of itself will be enough to fully uproot decades of doing business with China. Now, granted, there is the case to be made about geographical diversification, but such endeavors themselves will come at a cost. But I think from a political perspective, I think that's the bigger risk there, as you alluded to earlier. I can see how this global pandemic may give ammo for nationalists and potentially drive a wedge between the East and the West, with China potentially being made the scapegoat here. Now, I think the risk here is if that protectionist and nationalist sentiment then translates into actual policy, right? Be it on trade or investments or how people go about doing their businesses across borders. Now, I think that's the channel where the change could be most obvious.
And absolutely. We're talking about East and West. You're in the East there, Han, in Malaysia, and like 50% of the world's population, most of Malaysia is in lockdown. But unlike some countries in the West, are there reforms? Are there some economic measures that we've seen being given to citizens in places like Britain, France and America?
Certainly, the government here, policymakers here, both on the fiscal and monetary side, have done their part in trying to mitigate the financial and economic stress. So the support measures at the micro level include cash payments to frontliners, those in the healthcare sector, also cash payments to those at-risk segments of society, subsidies for electricity bill, free mobile data. So there's been a lot on that front. And even at the sectorial level, for sectors such as aviation and tourism that have been hit hard, billions have been rolled out to try and help them weather through these hopefully near-term headwinds here. But of course, there is this overall sense of caution because this is a health crisis as well as a humanitarian crisis, not just an economic and financial one. And given the lockdown measures that are in place, or rather I should say a movement control order that's in place, there's been a 97% compliance rate among Malaysians. So looks like almost everyone is willing to do their part to try and flatten that curve.